Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Flight podcast. I'm joined again by Terminal Philosophy for episode 25 of our History of Warfare stream, part 2 of the Roman unification of Italy. And the easiest way to describe the time frame we're about to cover is the life and times of Camillus, the second Romulus, as he was hailed after his victory over the Gauls. And it's broadly divided into three periods: the war against Veii, the war against Brennus, and then miscellaneous inconclusive wars against Volscians and Etruscans in his latter stages of life. And if we look at the three sources, are primarily the three primary ancient sources on this period would be Diodorus Siculus, Livy, and Plutarch. Livy is the most extensive. Diodorus Siculus is the least extensive. And each one has pros and cons in the application. But after around the 470s, there really isn't a lot of conflict with the Volscians or the Etruscans until around the beginning of the 5th century and the 4th century BC, where we see a renewed conflict with Veii. And one of the things that led to the Roman conquest of Veii was the fact that the Romans, the Etruscan city-states, were already entangled with the broader Gallic invasion, which we'll get to a bit later. But that meant that Veii's Etruscan city-state allies were indisposed and unable to come to aid. They had a few allies, the city-state of Falerii and Capena, but the Romans, when they marched out to besiege Veii, they had essentially two main armies: one to invest the city itself, and then one to position to intercept any supporting allies that would come to Veii's rescue. Now, early on, the siege was not carried on very well. The continued plebeian patrician arguments were going on. The plebeians didn't want to have a winter siege. But then one of the patricians was like, well, if we go home, we'll just have to do it all over again. And, we'll never get any advantage over the Veians. And that led to a lot of inconclusiveness. Also, their perennial Volscians are raiding the Romans. They captured the city of Anxur when the guard was on furlough of the city. And at the same time, the Volscians and Capetians were attacking the Romans at Veii. Now, the Romans suffer a serious reversal when the two consuls, Manius Sergius and Lucius Virginius, due to infighting and mutual recriminations, failed to support each other. So the Roman camp was commanded by Virginius, and the besieging force investing the city was controlled by Manius Sergius. Now, Sergius is attacked from within and from within by the Veians, and from without by the Falerians. And so what ends up happening is his force is annihilated, and they stream back to Rome. And when people are saying to Virginius, hey, help him out, he's like, nah, if he wants help, he'll ask me for it. And of course, Sergius wasn't going to ask for help. And so it was a disaster for the Romans. And basically, there's a long list of politicking and plebeian and patrician arguments. But basically, Sergius and Virginius are fired. They're relieved of their command. They elect new consuls, and Rome raises new armies. They're basically at war with four factions: Veii, Capena, Falerii, and the Volscians. So basically what ends up happening is Manius Aemilius and Cassio Fabius restore the besiege and invest Veii. Amphiaraus fights the Volscians to regain Anxur. Gnaeus Cornelius attacks Capena. Anxur is initially the Romans initially attempt a coup de main to take it, but due to the high ground and defensible position, they fail. The Romans then turn to investment, which eventually delivers the desired result of the city falling into their hands, in part taking advantage of the lax defense during a festival. The Romans are attacked by Veii, but they again, their fortifications hold. And one of the things that's used to galvanize the troops besieging Veii is that, hey, you don't want a repeat of the previous humiliation. Rome's honor is on the line. And eventually, according to both Livy and Plutarch, the Romans leverage an omen which stated that Veii would not fall until Lake Alban was drained. And so one of the Romans kidnaps the soothsayer, brings him to Rome, and the Romans are like, he says, yeah, you got to drain the lake first. The gods won't give you the city otherwise. And so taking advantage of this sort of attitude that, hey, if we can win this sort of moral victory by draining the lake, we can dispirit the Veians, which they do, which really just destroys Veian morale. They also send messengers to the Oracle at Delphi, who more or less confirms the omen, and that's where they decide to start draining the lake to then break the morale of the Veians. And they're still fighting, Acqui and the Volscians somewhat inconclusively. The war against the Volscians and Capetians is conducted by Gnaeus Gennicus L. Titinius. Neither of them were very talented in war and were routed in ambush. Gnaeus died in battle, but Titinius rallied the Romans from a hillock and at least stopped the flight. I mean, they didn't beat the Volscians, but they salvaged a little bit. Camillus is appointed dictator. Cornelius Scipio is appointed master of the horse. And finally, under Camillus's rule and military leadership, they defeat Veii. He invests the city. He then digs a tunnel underneath the city to pop up under the citadel, the central defensive structure, and then sort of attack them from within. And what ends up happening is he attacks the Veians all along the walls for a concerned effort, drawing them away from the heart of the city. And then his picked men, his elite troops, pop up underneath the city, causing chaos from within. Livy reports that some people say that there was a sacrifice to Jupiter going on, that whoever sacrificed this animal would be victorious in battle. And apparently, according to some accounts, that the Romans underneath the citadel heard it and jumped out of their hiding place to capture the animal and sacrifice it themselves. Though Livy argues that's not likely to have happened. It's one of those stories that if it didn't happen, it should have happened kind of thing. Eventually, Camillus gets into some trouble because he offers 1/10 of all the spoil to Juno, and he eventually gets banished from Rome because haggling over who's going to pay that 1/10, because there's disagreements on who's going to pay it, and at this point he's so popular that the Romans are suspicious of him, which leads to a lot of future problems. But the Veian conflict is brought to a successful conclusion by the Romans, again, starting to negotiate between the patricians and the plebeians, and putting in charge Camillus, the hero of Rome, as we'll see in the rest of this discussion. So, turning to philosophy, what are your thoughts on the Veian War?
Right. Well, that's an interesting period here. I mean, as we were discussing earlier, I think this is one of the more obscure chapters in Roman history that not a lot of people realize, that there was just a lot of, infighting on the Italian peninsula during this 4th and 3rd century BC. And again, as you mentioned earlier, like Livy, Plutarch, and Diodorus Siculus are the best sources at the time. And Plutarch argues at this time basically that Roman society was in a precarious state with the social gap widening between the plebeians and the patricians. There's a lot of debate about whether or not war should be waged in the winters. And, in terms of the actual warfare that was employed here, and from the Roman perspective, there is evidence that suggests that, frontier encampments and different forts were being established in order to fight winter campaigns so that Rome could fight longer wars against some of these neighboring city-states, including Veii and the Etruscans. In terms of this Camillus' successful siege of Veii, this is basically yet another example of the successful use of deception and ruse. Because he attacked the city on all sides, it basically it forced the defenders to leave many of the mines, and that gave Camillus the opportunity to send men underneath, basically through the sewers, and go to the city's citadel, and that's where they had the successful sacking of Veii. And of course, under Camillus's military under these, successful campaigns that he had against Veii and the Volscians, basically Rome had increased its territory gains by something like 60%, and they were able to give a lot of their land to a lot of needy citizens. And so, and this had basically made Rome one of the strongest city-states in the Central Peninsula. This isn't, now of course, this doesn't necessarily apply to the Gallic invasions that were happening in the north around like modern day Milan, and where, that Milanian plain meets the Alps. That was basically a different situation there. But under Camillus, they basically have a lot of successful gains. Now, of course, Camillus is banished because of his own politicking. But I think, your initial summary was just fine in that, he got himself into some trouble. And of course, there's the famous sort of situation where the school teacher was punished by Camillus, or that was something that was ordered by Camillus, because the school teacher and its students were basically mocking some of the men under Camillus, and this is basically kind of one of the situations that led to Camillus's banishment.
So before he's banished from Rome, there were a few other campaigns that Camillus did. The war with Phalaria is still going on, and he initially pursues a scorched earth policy to sort of like bait them out of their city to fight. But he eventually captures a guide and finds an elevated position above the city to fortify, to begin the process of investment. But it's somewhat difficult. He eventually sets it up and is preparing for a long siege. As you mentioned, the schoolmaster, he tries to betray the city by offering up the sons of the chief men as hostages. But Camillus refused the hostages and sends him back in humiliation to the city, which, according to both Livy and Plutarch, and I see no reason to doubt their accounts, so overawes the citizens that they would rather be a part of the Roman Commonwealth, which already has a lot of benefits going for it anyhow, that they just surrender and give Rome tribute. And Rome's like, cool, so we're done with that. They continue to fight the Aqui. Camillus and Spurius Postumius were in command. They defeat the Aqui, and Aemilius holds the city of Verrugo, and then Postumius pursues a policy of scorched earth. Postumius did not have proper security or scouting for his raids and was ambushed and destroyed by the Aqui fleeing to the hills. Postumius's men are rallied and counterattack, but since this was a night attack, the Romans at Verrugo think that they're surrounded and being attacked by the Aqui, so they flee to Tusculum and proclaim a Roman defeat. Only later on do the Romans learn that they won. So it's kind of a wash. They do win, sort of, but then they also lose their troops. And then lastly, the war against the Volscians is continued by L. Lucretius and C. Aemilius, and a campaign against the Salpinates by Agrippus Furius and Servius Sulpicius. The Volscians were defeated by the initial shock engagement, and then defeated by the Roman horse. And what I think is important here is that, again, we see that Roman cavalry, contrary to a lot of popular opinion, in its early days was the decisive element of Rome's victories. So Roman horse may not have been as good as, the Numidian cavalry that Hannibal was using, which we'll get to on a later lecture. But nonetheless, within Italy itself, it was one of the best. And eventually the Volscians sue for peace, because, and this is something we'll see again and again with the Volscians until the Latin War. Neither Rome nor the Volscians can achieve a knockout blow, and both sides just get tired of fighting and sue for peace. And that's why the Volscian conflicts do tend to get a little tedious. Getting to the Gallic invasion, we have essentially three sources, as I mentioned: Diodorus Siculus, Plutarch, and Livy. Now, the general consensus is that Camillus was ill-treated by the Romans, and that their defeat at the hands of the Gauls at Alia was sort of a disaster of their own making, given that Camillus was more or less a military genius and had the support of the troops and the citizens of Rome generally, except for his own missteps with the tribute, it left Rome. There was nobody else that could fill the role. And this gets back to a point that Livy made earlier, that Rome's early success was not due to its infantry, but its skilled leadership and its cavalry. So it's more the man in charge than the troops. That will change eventually, as we already briefly discussed with Pyrrhus, but that's still a ways off. The legionary model has not yet fully been embraced. And I think that's really why we have this great leader idea rather than great soldiers, because the legions are still in the process of being developed. And so the main Gallic tribes are the Boii, the Lingones, and the Senones. And they are migrating into Italy. Now, Livy argues that Clusium, the city they're attacking, some disaffected citizen was basically cucked and decided to get revenge by burning the Gauls. Which, again, if you want to make it that personal, that's one explanation. Also, Livy mentions that the Gauls were addicted to Italian wine, and they sort of wanted to have direct access to that. So it could be that as well. In all likelihood, Clusium was probably a pretext. And then they already had their own purposes for going into Etruria. And again, we already know that during the war with Veii, the Gauls were already conquering Etruscan city-states, which is why we don't see any aid coming to Veii. Now, the Romans send ambassadors Clusium asks Rome for help. So Rome sends, I think, 3 ambassadors. And the Romans and the Gauls are sort of posturing. They're both aggressive. Neither one wants to back down. And the Roman envoys jump into the fight on the side of the Etruscans, which even and this is something I got to point out. Livy is often the whipping boy for a lot of historians for being, writing Roman hagiographies. Oh, Rome is perfect. Rome never does anything wrong. Well, the account of the Gallic War here is, again, I think it's mostly projection. Livy very clearly states that the Romans did not put their best foot forward in this conflict and sort of unnecessarily provoked the Gauls to go all in. And then Brennus, who's the chieftain of the Gauls, after the initial engagement outside Clusium, they stop the attack and sort of take stock of what to do. Are the Romans really going to come in all the way? Do we want to push too far? And so they send envoys to Rome saying, you got to punish these guys. And initially the Senate's like, yeah, we should. But then in order to avoid making the decision, they leave it up to the plebs who say, no, these guys are heroes. And the Gauls are like, well, okay, you just violated the laws of nations and spit in our eyes, so we're gonna invade Rome. And this leads to Rome's greatest military disaster up to date, which is the Battle of Allia and the Sack of Rome. And so what ends up happening is that the Allia is a river at a junction with the Tiber. And at that juncture is where the Gauls try to cross. Diodorus Siculus says that the Celts had about 70,000 men, and Plutarch says the Romans had about 40,000. And basically what happens is the Roman formation, according to Plutarch and Livy, is that the Romans deployed their formations with their flanks anchored on the Allia River on the left and hills on the right. So, which would make sense, right? If they're outnumbered, they're going to want to have fixed flanks, just like in later periods like the Battle of Agincourt, the English would anchor their flanks on hills and forests. But unfortunately for the Romans, the crack Gallic forces, Celtic forces, were opposite the Roman hill position, which was defended by the weakest of the Romans. And they were, again, a lot of these ancient battles, the descriptions are not as detailed as you might like. They're driven off the hill, and then they pivot and roll up the Roman flank, roll up the Roman center, and the Romans scatter and tear and cross the Tiber. Many drown because they're weighed down by their own armor, and then the Celts shower them with javelins, killing many more. The remnants of the army flee to Veii, and then a few men make it to Rome and say there was this tremendous disaster that happened, that Rome was completely annihilated. And now, granted, more men survived than were reported to have survived because the men that made it to Rome didn't know how many made it to Veii. So they sort of over-reported the disaster. But According to Diodorus Siculus, the first day the Gauls waited because they were headhunting. They decapitated the Roman prisoners because the Celts were known to be headhunters. And on the second and third days, they were wondering, what the heck is going on in Rome? See, at the time, the Romans in the city were putting the older men were kind of left as cannon fodder out in the city because there was not enough food to feed them. It was the women and the children and the younger men were put into the citadel to protect and defend it, and they evacuated most of the city except for the citadel. And while this is going on, the Gauls are like, well, the gates are open. There's all this stuff going on. This must be a trap. So for the second and third day, the Gauls are just wondering what the heck is going on. On the fourth day, they invade. They burn the city to the ground, except for the citadel. According to Livy, they kill all the elders. When one of them uses his staff and hits a guy on the head for pulling his beard, and they try to assault the citadel directly, which they fail. Then they begin to invest it. But the problem is the Gauls, they're not disciplined enough to have a coherent cordon over Rome. And so what ends up happening is they start looting and pillaging the surrounding countryside, getting drunk on Roman wine. And finally, Camillus, who is banished to the city of Adria, is like, hey, you know what? The Gauls are coming for you too. Let's raise an army and fight them. So he raises an army. He joins up, and he defeats a bunch of drunken Celts. And so do the Romans in Veii. And they join forces. And then they send a messenger named Pontius Camillus to Rome itself. He finds a footpath up to the citadel to tell them that reinforcements are coming, don't lose hope. And what ends up happening is that the Celts see this, and they try to come up and attack. And that's where we hear about the sacred geese of Juno, who warn the Romans, and Marcus Malleus leads the defense and drives off the Celts. But due to shortage of food supplies, they start negotiations with Brennus to bribe for 1,000 pounds of gold to get them to leave. And I really think Plutarch says it best. You know, there's that great scene where Brennus has the scale, and he puts a sword on it and says, "Woe to the vanquished." And then Camillus marches up with his army, and he says that it was the custom with Romans to deliver their city with iron and not with gold. And then, you know, he says to Brennus, well, look, I'm dictator. These people don't have the right to treat with you. I'm the supreme authority in Rome right now. 2 battles were fought against the Celts, which then drove them out. According to Livy, they were both outstanding smashing successes, whereas Plutarch says, well, the first battle was kind of inconclusive because they're fighting in the streets of a burned out city in which nobody can gain the upper hand, so they both withdraw and fight near the city of Gabii a day later. And then they are defeated pretty decisively. And at this point, you know, Camillus is hailed as the head of the second Romulus, the savior of Rome. And while the Romans are negotiating whether to leave Rome and abandon it to its fate and move to Veii, there's that unnamed centurion who marches his century up and says, you know, here, we're going to stay, we're going to stand. And after the speech of Camillus and this perceived good omen, the Romans decide to stay and rebuild. And both Livy, Plutarch, and Diodorus Siculus says that the reason why Rome as a city is kind of a hodgepodge is that when they rebuilt it after the Gallic destruction, they just sort of left it up to each man's own devices. So, turn of philosophy, what are your thoughts on the Gallic War and Camillus and Brennus?
Right. Well, something interesting that you mentioned earlier is that you know, this modern sort of reputation with Livy. I mean, I would say yes, it's true to say that Livy is a popular laughingstock among some modern secular historians because of, again, this more mythological interpretation of history. And, you know, in terms of Livy, more specifically, you know, a general favoritism towards Rome. However, I mean, if you read Livy with some level of diligence, it's actually clear that, you know, he depicts Rome as the people who offended the gods and paid for it in defeat against the Gauls in this battle of Alea. Now, just before the battle, the weeks leading up to it, Brennus, you know, who is this, you know, the king of the Gallic tribes, you know, on his approach to Rome after successfully defeating Clusium, he did not provoke any other city-states. He was really seeking conflict only with Rome. And, he was sort of doing a bit of politicking here, trying to basically lean on this idea of the enemy of my enemy is my friend type of a thing. And he did that fairly well because, again, before the Gauls had reached Roman territory, there was a lot of, as we've been discussing, there's been all sorts of conflicts with Veii, with the Etruscans, the Volscians. And of course, this is still before the Latin wars, the various Latin tribes to the east of the central Italian peninsula. But he was aware of the situation that Rome had made a lot of enemies at this point, and he was trying his best to, create some sort of popular demand against Rome. And so, anyways, with this iconic battle of the Battle of the Allia, you had offered a good summary, but basically the Gauls successfully defeat the Romans, where the Roman flank on the hill, which was to the east of the river, basically fails to hold against Gallic attack, and then the entire Roman formation sort of collapses in on itself to the point of where they're packed in like sardines in this basically this pocket formation, and they have their backs to the river, and they're trying to fight the Gallics, again in this pocket formation, which is not in the Roman military comfort zone. And so again, this forces them to rout. Many men drown, and many of them are, have javelins thrown at them as they're as they leave their armor and weapons behind. And so it's basically just a humiliating defeat for Rome. Rome had not, Rome was successful in other Roman-like enemies like the Veii and the Etruscans because there are similar tactics being used. But of course, what separated Rome from a lot of these other city-states was the successful and widespread use of cavalry and in Alexander-like flanking formations, whereas whether it was due to lack of availability of horses or people just less skilled, and there was not as many equestrian traditions in these other Roman city-states, Rome was really the best game in town in terms of cavalry being used on an army-wide level. So, but they were really they were probably the foremost force in that part of Italy with cavalry. But however, due to the terrain and just the way that the formations were established by the time that both armies met for battle, the Romans basically put themselves to a disadvantage by putting their less quality men on the hill, whereas they probably should have inverted their formation the way that they had it. That would have prevented this collapsing in on itself towards the riverbank. So, anyways, that was the Battle of Allia, one of Rome's arguably most humiliating defeats, other than maybe the Teutoburg Forest, or if I think I have that name correct. But and then of course several days later, the Gauls invade and sack Rome. And of course, one thing that the Gauls brought with them was, just more of a tribal society, and they didn't really have a way of occupying Rome. And so, I think they're, more or less, Brennus, even though he's the big man at the top of all the Gallic tribes, he has the responsibility of keeping all these other chieftains happy and supplied and drunk on wine. And so the best way to continue that and the best way to retain his power is basically by raiding the countryside. And at this time, this basically creates the demand for Camillus's return from banishment. And so, there's, basically Camillus, despite, some of the difficult politicking, or maybe perhaps the bad politicking that he had done, at least he probably should not have been banished, because he was, again, he was the Rommel for Rome at the time. He was creating all of these incredible gains despite fighting multiple enemies at once. Maybe not all those enemies were incredibly robust, say like the Volscians, but still, the banishment of Camillus basically signaled the end for Rome in this situation where the Gallics just had a large army, and they were well supplied, and they were on basically this winning streak of plundering other Roman establishments. I wouldn't say the entire peninsula, of course, because again, as we both mentioned, on their approach to Rome, it's pretty clear that Brennus was trying to play his cards well and not sacking everything and creating a coalition against him of different Roman city-states. So, but yeah, I mean, this basically created the demand for Camillus' return, and what we see after that is basically just a lead up to we're now working towards basically the lead up to the Latin Wars.
Yeah, one thing that's, I think, interesting to point out here is how the ancient sources agree and disagree or fill in each other's blank spots. Because if we look at like Plutarch, there's a lot of Brennus when he's talking to the Romans and the Romans talking to Brennus. There's a lot of sort of frankness about it. Brennus says, well, you Romans are telling me not to attack these people for my own benefit, but look at how you guys built your kingdom already. Like, don't you tell me what to do. I'm doing the same thing you're doing. Let the strong decide. And as you said, he prudently only attacked Roman allies to tell the other tribes, hey, look, you know what? We're not here to fight you. We're here to fight the Romans. And there is this level of frankness about how policy is made. And, the Romans and the Gauls are not really using euphemisms to justify what they're doing. And we'll see that the two victories over Brennus that Camillus has, Livy does seem to say, he says after the first battle, it was a great victory for Rome as Alia was for the Celts. But if you read Plutarch, it's like, yeah, kind of inconclusive, just fighting in a ruined city. You had to get out of the city to actually have a decisive battle. Very different accounts. Diodorus Siculus seems to think that the Romans just paid the Gauls off and didn't even actually beat them. So it's interesting how these don't always agree, but they do agree in several key particulars. All of them agree on the 1,000-pound gold tribute. They sort of disagree on how that fleshed out at the end. They all agree on the Alia. They all agree that the Roman forces in Veii that were the remnants of Alia defeated the Gauls. They all agree about the sacred geese and all that other stuff. So there are these sort of like core points they agree on. But there's also these little nuances that are different. Some of them might just be a nuance and could be complementary. Some do appear to be directly contradicting each other. But everybody sort of agrees that the Romans treated the Gauls pretty badly, and they sort of had it coming. And while Diodorus doesn't mention Camillus, both Plutarch and Livy seem to think Camillus was treated rather badly as well, and that the Romans were sort of asking for it, which is interesting. And while the actual nitty-gritty of the battles in the campaign are pretty sparse, it does seem that the Gauls were defeated primarily because they were just a very large raiding party. They didn't really have a long-term goal. They weren't going to conquer land, to live in it, to incorporate it into their tribe. They just wanted loot and plunder. And eventually, they got tired of military discipline and, consumed a lot of wine and did a lot of feasting. So they basically, Camillus just kills them all when they're drunk and asleep. So, that's the Gauls were sort of their own worst enemy at that point. And so, again, what Rome has that nobody else has at the time is very deep manpower reserves. And it has very deep manpower reserves because Rome has this system of integration, as I've said before, and it bears repeating. In antiquity, you had two choices, slavery or death, if you were defeated. Rome gave you a third option, and that was very attractive. Lots of nations took Rome's third option. And by fully integrating even defeated nations, which we'll get to later with the Volscians and the Samnites, fully integrated into the Roman system. I mean, it's kind of crazy to think that the Volscians, who've been a thorn in Rome's side for 3 centuries, can be fully integrated as allies. Yet Rome did that, and to their, that gave them the strength to resist Pyrrhus, and later the strength to resist Hannibal. And the Celts, just didn't have that kind of staying power. Now, I agree with Peter Connolly that the transitionary legion that Livy talks about between, say, the Battle of Allia and the Second Samnite War is the result of the defeat at Allia, where the Romans are still using their phalangic formation without much of a defense in depth. And so when the initial shock of the Gallic warband breaks the enemy line, there's no follow-up. There's no reserve to call on. And I agree with his interpretation that because they didn't have a backup, a reserve to defeat this attack, that led them to totally rethink their military structure, which was an evolutionary period that, with their combat with the Gauls, the combat with the Samnites, finally culminates in the Second Samnite War with the Legion as we know it. What we would today call the Polybian Legion, even though it's a little bit before the war with Hannibal. And so I think that the fact that the Romans realized that this inability to take a hit from the Gauls, because the whole barbarian strategy, which we see, which we already talked about with the collapse of the successor state of Cassander in Thrace by the Gauls, was just the fury of these swordsmen just broke the phalanx, just shattered it, and they just went all the way down to Thermopylae. So, you had to change how you organized. And I think that is the way we can sort of contextualize all this. So, terminal philosophy, what are your thoughts on that?
Right. Well, again, as Plutarch and Livy and Diodorus Siculus discuss in their works, this period after the sacking of Rome by the Gauls it's less clear because, again, I think you said it best, whereas the Gauls were sort of their own worst enemy. I mean, I would say that, just to expand on that a bit, the Gauls were defeated again by their own methodology. There was no political or imperial vision. They just came down from the Alps and they were there to plunder and attack cities and farms and basically get drunk on Roman wine. I don't think there was really any practical way for Brennus to sort of maintain this loose confederation of tribes. Again, they were there to go down, it's similar to Scythians further to the east. There was no established empire or infrastructures. They were just people from various encampments, and they wanted to go down to these established, robust cities and take all the nice, material gains of city life. And so they basically had no long-term plan. And of course, that would be their own undoing, because after Camillus returns to Rome, and after a year of rebuilding Rome under different under some slightly different aesthetics because of the lack of traditional Roman supplies. Basically, Rome did look quite a bit different after it was rebuilt. But after the return of Camillus, basically he was able to drive out the Gauls because they were just they were not as organized. And then again, if the Romans had met, if the Battle of Veii were different, where they met further north or further south from the river, from where they were by, there's a specific bend by the river that ended up being more advantageous for the Gauls, because it just allowed for this envelopment to more easily develop after their right flank had failed. If it had happened further north or further south, you could argue maybe that it would have been a different outcome, but kind of an unlucky day for Rome. But I also agree too, and I had come across this somewhat recently, that with Peter Conley's thesis that, after this defeat and sacking of Rome, and with the Gauls unable to not know what to do ultimately with Rome other than to just continue south and east of Rome and basically plunder the countryside for, either gold or basically wine and women and slaves and things like that, this had allowed Rome sometime, even despite senators being slaughtered and many of the people and, the defense garrison being killed, this allowed Rome an opportunity for some self-reflection for future military operations on tactics and strategy. And really, again, if the Gauls had maybe some more, robust visions of the future for Rome, then maybe Rome would have just ultimately ended up being this footnote in history. But due to this sort of, Viking-like, tribal-like military approach. This is what allowed Rome to survive, basically. So, but I would say that, in terms of, between the sacking of Rome and the rebuilding of Rome, and all the way up to the beginning of the Latin Wars, there's not much here. I mean, again, there's some renewed campaigns, both in the summers and the winters, again, because of this slightly more common use of frontier encampments and forts against the Volscians and things like that. There's no real clear, big, juicy battles that is reported by Livy or Diodorus Siculus or Plutarch. So basically, it's just a kind of a rebuilding period for Rome and taking advantage of, after the Gallic invasions sort of lose their steam, Rome is, able to reestablish itself. And this is one point that you made earlier that I think, absolutely bears repeating. And, and we talked about this a lot in the Pyrrhic Wars, which is Rome has this ability to just raise armies so quickly, more, I think, better than any other army of antiquity. I think, one, because of its societal structure, and even though that there was constant clashings between the plebeians and patricians, the Roman Senate could delegate to its people that, the necessity to raise an army, or, we're going to lose everything. And, the Roman people enjoyed this life under a republic a lot more because, again, in this brutal world of antiquity, there was either slavery or death. And with this third option being introduced by the Romans and sort of an integration of different gods, people, despite all of the issues with patricians that the plebeians had to deal with, life under Rome was better than basically anywhere else that they were aware of. So I think that's basically the TLDR of why Rome was worth fighting for. And I think that was more apparent and more self-evident in the wars with Pyrrhus. But even here, I think it's fairly clear that this Roman system of its ability to rebuild politically, materialistically, and militarily is probably better than anywhere else in the world at this point.
Now, for the remainder, there's, broadly speaking, the continued war with the Etruscans and the Volscians are TLDR inconclusive. But within these conflicts, there are some interesting things to highlight. So, again, the military career of Camillus is again very important. After the Gauls are defeated, they're still continuing war with the Volscians and with the Etruscans. And when we look at the towns that are still, I guess, loyal to or governed by the remnants of the Tarquin, such as Cortusa and Cantabernia, they were taken by the Romans, the former by a coup de main and the latter by intimidated and surrendered by superior numbers. Camillus continues to wage war against the Volscians and the Etruscans. He, in 386, he's attacking the Etruscans at Nepete and Sutrium, and they were dealt with by Camillus. And then a second army was raised by Valerius Poplicia to defeat the Volscians. The two armies combined. Now, when Camillus fights the Volscians, there's a bit of a disagreement in the narrative. Well, again, a bit of a digression in the narrative between Livy and Plutarch. So Livy says, well, the master of the horse, Lucius Furius, wanted to attack the Gauls or the Volscians, and Camillus is like, no, hold on, let's have a more systematic method. Camillus really likes to use investment and sieges. He achieved success at Veii with that, and it's a more certain success. It's less risky. It takes more time though, and so. But because the army was sort of half governed, half by Camillus, half by Furius, Camillus sort of builds up a reserve in case Furius does something stupid, which he does. He attacks the Volscians on the high ground, and again, apparently he didn't know about Obi-Wan Kenobi. He can't win because I have the high ground, but he's defeated and routed And so Camillus comes to his aid and defeats the Volscians and salvages the Roman defeat, and then defeats the Volscians. Whereas Plutarch gives a slightly different account. It says that Camillus was sick and that Camillus was not engaged, but seeing that the Romans were being routed, he then jumps to the cause and defeats them. Both accounts agree, though, that Camillus eventually annexes the Roman town of Tusculum. And so at that point, we sort of see a conclusion to that round of fighting. The last major war with the Etruscans in this period is in the 350s with the Volsci and the Tarquini. And what happens is we see the Tarquin, again, constantly ravaging Roman territories. They raise an army, Gaius Fabius and Bustus, to fight, but is defeated by the Etruscans, and they massacre 307 POWs. The next consul, Gnaeus Manlius Capitolinus, is not very effective either. He's not defeated. He just sort of holds his ground and fortifies the Roman position. Now, eventually, the Romans do appoint consuls who can win. M. Fabius Ambustus engages the Volsci and the Tarquins, and he was routed by the Etruscans, who intimidated the Romans when they brought their priests out wielding snakes and burning torches. Apparently, just scared the Romans. But eventually, this is the thing we see a lot with Rome. The troops might eventually be defeated, but they're later shamed, and they rally and fight back. Most ancient armies would just keep on running. But the Romans have this staying power, this like esprit de corps, where it's like, we're going to bros to the end, and they eventually rebound from their defeats. In order to bring the Romans to their knees, the Etruscans try to attack Rome's salt works. Salt is sort of like a universal preservative. It's the essential ingredient to an ancient economy. But under Rutulius, dictator C. Marcius Rutulius, they, in a lightning strike, cross the Tiber, surprise the Etruscans, take 8,000 prisoners in their camp, and then destroy them. And then from like 355 to 351, there's inconclusive skirmishing, destruction of property and soil, and eventually the Etruscans sue for a 40-year peace. Again, inconclusive. And one can say the same with the Volscians as well. It's generally inconclusive. What we see, again, is that with the Volscians, there are Roman cavalry are decisive. And the broad contours of this engagement are the Romans will win some and lose some, but because they have the overall staying power and the Volscians are a little more than raiders and a nuisance, they eventually just burn enough Volscian crops so they get tired of fighting and sue for peace. And this sort of like yo-yo keeps on going on until the Latin War, which we'll get to in a later lecture, where Rome finally gets a decisive win and consolidates everything. And so where I would end is that Rome at this point still is an alliance of more or less equals. The Latins, the Romans, the Hernici, they're more or less equals in this alliance. After the Latin War, which we'll get to later, Rome is now the first among equals amongst the alliance. And I think that's why Rome's conflicts at this point are so inconclusive. Rome doesn't have the dominant position to command obedience from all the other allies. There's still a lot of negotiation. There's still a lot of give and take. They don't have a lot of bilateral agreements yet. And so once Rome fully consolidates central Italy, then it becomes an unstoppable steamroller. Terminal philosophy, what are your thoughts on that?
Right. Well, without repeating too much of what you had covered, I think that's a good summary. Of course, eventually there is sort of this yin and yang between, defeats and victories between Rome and the Etruscans and the Volscians. As you mentioned just recently, Rome doesn't have this consolidated power that it does have post the Latin Wars, and with its successfully defeating these various Latin nations, if you want to call them that. But I think this hard lesson that was learned by the Gallic invasion and the sacking of Rome is that this basically meant that they had to rework their politics at home between the plebeians and the patricians, because had things been more settled between those two social classes, waging campaigns would have been met with less resistance and probably could have been more successful. And then two is that there needed to be this refinement of the legion and the way that cavalry is fielded and the way that it's used on flanks. So, and again, this will be brought more apparent in the Latin wars. But again, I think one of the reasons why this period after the sacking of Rome and the rebuilding of Rome and these sort of various small battles that do pop up with the Etruscans and the Volscians is that again, Rome doesn't have these huge numbers yet where they can just take on the entire peninsula and hold the territory. It's very often in this period that one city-state will conquer, maybe a river valley or maybe, 60 square kilometers of territory, but then lose it because they don't have the men to hold it. That's just something that's just very common throughout the history of antiquity. However, we'll see after the Latin League's defeat in the Latin Wars that Rome has consolidated a lot more power and has brought a lot more manpower under its influence, and that they can wage multiple wars at the same time and hold its territory. And again, because of this non-barbaric third option, people are more, willing to accept Roman rule than anything else because they and their families get to live, and and it's not living under a kingdom. It is technically a republic. I think that's something that needs to be bears repeating. But I think that's a decent summary that you offered, post the sacking of Rome and the rebuilding of Rome.
So just to sort of give a strategic overview of the trends thus far in Roman history, is we see that due to the republican system and the need to have the plebeians fight in these battles, they're the ones that are fighting and dying, the way that they're able to maximize their manpower mobilization is by increasing concessions to the plebeians. First by the tribune, and then by giving them more favorable laws from the tribune. And this is something that we see is that you can get men to fight harder and to endure greater hardship if they feel like they have a stake in the system. Compare this to, say, Persia and the invasion of Greece. Many of these troops didn't fight very hard because they had no stake there. In fact, in his life of Themistocles, the reason why Plutarch states that Themistocles, the reason why he didn't destroy the bridge over the Hellespont was the Persians would fight to the death. They'd be on what Sun Tzu calls death ground if they were trapped in Europe. He wanted to give them the Golden Bridge to fly out, which means the Persians wouldn't put up a fight. Exactly. They're slaves, they're conscripts, they don't want to be here. While the Persians could raise vast armies, they were inconsequential. The Romans, of course, were different. They could also raise vast armies, but they did it with a level of consent that the Persians never had. And that level of consent was crucial because they could demand more of their troops without fear of revolt, without fear of dissension, and get them to keep going. And also, encourage people to join the Roman system. So we see that the success of Rome in Italy leads to a more and more populous strand, which ultimately will culminate in demagogues like Julius Caesar. I mean, you can go too far in the populist direction. But we see that as Rome's military might grows and its military demands grow, Rome must give more concessions to the plebs. The other thing that we see is that Roman boundaries don't change much in the 5th and 4th centuries. And that's because Rome does not have enough control to just expand like a steamroller. Again, it's still kind of first among equals amongst the alliance structure. It's only after the Latin War that they become, the guy that can make all the decisions. In which case, now they can just have this overwhelming steamroller and just wipe out the Samnites, the Gauls and the Etruria, and then even Pyrrhus. And then at that point, then Rome has everything together, and it's more of a unitary state than a confederation at this point. And that gives Rome, but Rome isn't there yet. And furthermore, through all of this continued fighting with various diverse nations, Rome is developing its signature legion. And it's this trial and error, which again Rome is renowned for, learning from its enemies, that it's finally able to develop this battle-winning formation, the legion. And so I think that's the big strategic picture of Rome at this time. As we go into the Samnite Wars, is there anything you want to add to that, Terminal?
No, I think that's great. That's a great summary. I think it is true to say that, of course, these territorial gains in the 4th and 5th centuries are not very great. I mean, I think Camillus can be credited for some big territorial gains, but again, this is mostly related to the broader river valley of the Tiber and not like, like Soviet level gains of territory or Blitzkrieg level gains of territory. So again, they are, as you said, in a trial and error phase here of trying to refine the legion, as well as, and there's another, one other thing I will say is that Rome was also good at setting up colonies on the eastern coast of the peninsula. And they basically, had a way of, it was almost like a way of retaining soft power in other parts of Italy. But without getting into that too much, I think I'll just end my comments there. And looking forward to the Latin Wars.
All right. Thanks again, Terminal Philosophy.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. This is Todd Lewis of the Prayers of Folly podcast, signing off.